Try to play. You are seeing it on your screen, correct? Okay.
Yes.
Looks like, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're very lucky to have as our featured speaker Dr. Anjan Chakravartty.
How is the volume?
Put it
Can
up.
you hear it? Yeah? Okay.
He grew up in
Make
Canada.
it a little louder.
He has his
For me.
bachelor's
I
in
think you might have to make it louder at your ends.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, yeah.
biophysics and a master's in philosophy from the University of Toronto, and then from the University of Cambridge. He has a master's in philosophy from that, as well as a PhD. More recently, a grant was made to the University of Miami for a chair. A chair in university parlance means an endowed position, for which there are specific funds, usually for a kind of specific purpose. A chair for the study of atheism, humanism, and secular ethics. So we're very, very pleased to have him speak to us. He's very thoughtful, and I believe you're going to enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Carrie.
He's still.
All right, so let's return to thinking about some of the different ways in which science and values are inevitably entangled. So earlier I talked about directions of scientific research, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about scientific methods of investigation. One very obvious way in which values inevitably infiltrate our methods concerns ethical values.
I know.
So especially when it comes to studying things that are alive, or studying things in ways that may affect living things or the environment. For example, should we use animals in research? If so, then should we use them always for anything? Or should there be certain circumstances under which we think it's a good idea and other circumstances under which we think it might just be frivolous? What about research that involves human subjects? Today, in most places, we have ethical review boards that have to approve research plans whenever they involve human beings. But that wasn't always the case, right? There are amazing historical examples of work that, from our current ethical perspective, might be uncomfortable for us to think about now, or that we might find troubling. Here's a nice example, which I'm sure many of you have come across at some point. The Milgram experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s at Yale. Not surprisingly, after the Second World War and the horrors of the Nazi state and the Nazi science infrastructure, there was a lot of interest in better understanding how people respond to authority when it clashes with their personal conscience. In the Milgram experiments, volunteers were solicited to help do the science, but what they didn't know was that actually they weren't just helping to run the experiment. In fact, they were the subjects of the experiment. Right? So already here you have something that would probably be a violation, would be a violation of what's allowed today. So here's the basic idea of the experiment. The volunteers were told that they were helping to run an experiment on how people learn things. Actually, it was an experiment on what lengths people will go to doing unethical things if they're told to do them by an authority figure. So the volunteer was shown a learner, restrained and hooked up to what looked like electrodes. And then the volunteer was taken into a different room where he could still communicate with the learner, and from which he could give the learner a test. Right? So the test was a memory test. The volunteer would read pairs of words to the learner and then ask him to repeat them. If the learner got something wrong, the volunteer was told by an authority figure, right? Perhaps someone in a lab coat with a clipboard, right, looking seriously scientific, to push a button that would give the learner an electric shock. And for every wrong answer, the voltage would go up. Now, as it happens, there was no learner and there were no shocks, right? The learner was an actor, the shocks were pretend, but the volunteers didn't know this. So the whole setup was just to see how far someone would go in what they believed was causing pain to someone else when this was sanctioned by somebody in a position of authority. They had taped sounds that they would use so that when a shock, a pretend shock was given, the learner would sound like he was banging on the wall or crying out in pain or begging for mercy. And then at some point, when the shocks continued, they would just stop making sounds at all. In the first experiments that Milgram did, 65% of people were willing to go all the way up to the maximum voltage, 450 volts. Everyone was willing to go up to 300 volts. As you can imagine, they were tortured by this, right? So they showed all kinds of signs of nervousness and ultimately emotional stress, in some cases quite severe. This is now a classic example of a research methodology that one might argue was probably ethically compromised. She describes a case in which values are, she argues, a required part of scientific reasoning itself. They aren't something that you could strip out, even if you wanted to. Sometimes values are required even to know how to read and interpret the data of scientific work. As you know, we have a scary history of toxic byproducts from manufacturing and other factory processes being released into the environment, where they've done immense harm. Dioxins are one example of this. They're produced in various ways. They're produced in making herbicides, in pulp and paper, like bleaching paper, and so on. At a certain point, worries started to arise about the possible effects on human health of the release of this chemical waste product into lands where they were contaminating the water and building up in sources of food like dairy, meat, and fish. And as we know now, dioxins actually cause all kinds of very serious problems in humans, including cancers. But to know these things, we had to investigate. What they did was expose rats to varying levels of dioxin, and then they performed autopsies to see what effect this had. In the first long-term study, this was published in 1978, they focused on liver cancer. And to make a long story short, here's the challenge. When examining the slides that were prepared from liver biopsies, some were clearly cancerous, some were clearly not, and then there were a bunch that were in between, where it wasn't entirely clear how they should be classified. In fact, it could be a very tough call to make, and even experts could disagree. In fact, they did disagree. So how do you classify the data? If you're very strict one way, and classify anything that's unclear, right, in that nebulous zone as cancerous, then you run the risk of false positives. That is, the risk of counting something as cancerous when actually it isn't. On the other hand, if you're very strict the other way and classify anything that's unclear as not cancerous, well, then you run the opposite risk, right? The risk of false negatives. That is, counting genuinely cancerous, not counting genuinely cancerous slides. How do we strike the balance in these sorts of cases? On reflection, right, when you think about how best to do that, values inevitably play a role. I mean, what are we most concerned about? If we err on the side of caution, we're more likely to protect human health, but maybe at the cost of the profitability of manufacturers who will now have to pay more to reduce environmental pollution. If we err on the side of being less cautious, well, then it's more likely that manufacturers will be more profitable and perhaps they'll be able to hire greater numbers of people and support the kind of economic development that really helps a community, maybe at the cost of human health. Sometimes values are central to how we actually do science, how we do things like read and interpret scientific evidence.
Carrie? How can we make sure that the work is done thoroughly and accurately? Is there an opportunity for review? So the question is, how do we get more thoughtful evaluation and correction?
Well, I think, there's good news and bad news, and hopefully over time the good news trumps the bad news. One of the challenges that you've just pointed out is just a fact of life, and there's no getting around it. And that is that when it comes to working out what the facts of the matter are in any particular area of inquiry, and you've been involved in several, so you know, the conclusions we reach outstrip our data. I mean, we have data, but then we need to make a leap from that data. When people are claiming that they've detected the latest subatomic particle at CERN in Geneva, it's not because they've seen the particle, it's because they have a lot of very complicated data, right? Computer models and so on and so forth, from which they infer that they've been successful in detecting a particle. You always have to make a leap from your data to draw whatever conclusion you're drawing. And that leap may carry more or less risk. And that is just a fact of life, and there's no way of getting around it. On the other hand, so that's the bad news, that's just our human condition. I mean, that's just, something we have to face up to. On the other hand, I think some of the strategies are the kinds of strategies that we use to try to mitigate the risk associated when we take leaps from the data. And sometimes it just takes time because it's hard to think of all of the ways in which we might be wrong, especially at the early stage of inquiry. So I think, we really need to think about scientific inquiry in a diachronic kind of light. When we start to look in a particular area, the science is inevitably going to be relatively unsettled, and there are going to be lots of things we haven't thought of. And over time, in part because scientists like to argue with each other so much, a lot of the confounding factors and other possibilities will come to light, and we can't do anything except investigate. I think there's a balance to be struck. As scientists, and you will know this, I mean, you can't just roll over every time someone says, well, I can explain your data differently. If we always rolled over, we'd never make any progress. We need to give a hypothesis a chance to survive in the face of all the investigation we're doing. On the other hand, we can't be dogmatic. If we find ourselves going to such lengths that our explanations now, right, just so we can hold on to our pet theory, are becoming more and more ridiculous, well, then we know that it's time, to switch teams. So this is a diachronic process. It isn't something that is fixed. It's something that develops over time. And if we employ some of the strategies that I suggested we should make sure are part of our scientific endeavor to Sandeep, then we stand the best chance of doing that over time.
Gravity in the queue here. What's going on with COVID-19, and science is not geared to coming through typically with fast answers for these type of things.
I think this is a diachronic process, and so people want fast answers right away, and fast answers can always be given, but they're always given then in a context of very high uncertainty. And one of the things we're doing is we're always trying to boost the probability that whatever provisional hypothesis we have or theory we come up with is true. And it's just a fact that at the very beginning, when there are so many possibly confounding factors, like in the case of a new virus and a new disease and what might be mitigating treatments, the uncertainty is high. I mean, it just is high. And answers can always be given, but they're always just the best answers we can give at that time. And the level of uncertainty will diminish in time, but it may not be fast enough for our liking. In this case, it's certainly not fast enough for our liking. People do the best they can with the information they have. Hydroxychloroquine, was there ever a good reason for thinking that it might work? Not really. So then immediately you would assign a low probability to that hypothesis. Then some people report that actually, you know what, I think it's working. That's anecdotal evidence. It's not particularly high up on the chain of the rankings of most powerful evidence ever, but it's something, and in a time of high uncertainty, it might take on some value. So then you've got some mitigating data. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And this is a case where experts may not always disagree, but as citizens who are not experts, we're really reliant on expert judgment. And in cases where fast answers are needed, I think the best thing we can do is rely on the preponderance of expert judgment, even understanding that it's in a context of high uncertainty and they may change their minds. Thank you for joining in tonight.
All right, so we're all here together. Yeah, bravo. Things that need to be reflected on. So I'm going to leave the floor open because there's just a lot of grist for our mill right there and then. And if the conversation lags, I'll throw in some stuff from the article. But if anyone has any reactions, questions for Anjan, or just comments.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts.
Sorry. Go ahead. Any questions, comments about science and hypotheses and what we can know, what we can't know, if there's limits to research?
Lima, could I say just a couple of things about
yes, please.
The video? And I won't take up much time, but
go ahead.
One thing I wanted to mention is that, as you can tell, the kind of music video quality of the video is a result of them taking bits and pieces of a talk that I did and kind of stitching them together. So if you're interested, on the same website, there are actually 3 such things that they did, corresponding basically to ways in which I discussed values being important to and often just integral to or even inextricable from scientific practice. And so this was one of them, the idea that sometimes values are just part and parcel of our methods. And we would be naive to think that somehow we can extricate them completely in certain cases, and in fact, in many cases. The other 2 videos, one of them is about directions of scientific research, how our values end up shaping what we as a society and what scientists as a society within the larger society end up investigating. And so that's a kind of interesting topic in and of itself. There are lots of things we could investigate, but of course, we don't investigate all of them, right? Science is extraordinarily expensive and there are only so many scientists and so on and so forth. There are limited resources. And so we make decisions about what we will actually subject to scientific inquiry. And those choices are made on the basis of values at some level, right? And often at multiple levels. So that was one of the other things I talked about. The final thing that I talked about was the idea that values are important in the context of thinking about not just the directions of science or the methods of science, but actually important in thinking about the sort of hidden assumptions that we often bring to scientific inquiry. Assumptions that shape what ends up being accepted as scientific fact, but that may incorporate some values that need to be brought to the light of day or illuminated, because sometimes these values have shaped what we end up taking as scientific fact in unfortunate ways. Things like sexist biases or racialized biases or so on and so forth. So I just wanted to mention that those other 2 videos are there, one on directions and one on the sort of hidden assumptions. This one was about methods. The piece that Glima sent around by my former colleague at Notre Dame, Janet Kurani, is all about the question of directions of scientific research. One of the other things that I addressed in one of the other stitched up rock video segments. And in that piece, she's arguing that the directions of scientific research should not just be left to free choice on the part of scientists, that there actually should be some sort of oversight and guidance with respect to what we allow to be investigated scientifically. So that's a provocative thing, and the piece isn't very long, so I thought some of you might enjoy that. The last thing that I will say is that because they stitched the video that we just watched in some slightly unfortunate ways, at one point I say, she argues, but of course they cut out the person's name, which is not really best practice. So the person's name was Heather Douglas. The example of the cancer study involving dioxins is something that I borrowed from her. She's another colleague of mine. She's at Michigan State University.
Science is practiced as a science, and particularly an experimental science. I had some ideas on your what you said about you were talking about values, bringing your values, and I can see that as personal values, and every researcher has something there that's motivating them to do the thing that they're doing, and so they're bringing that to them. And of course, the idea of when you teach a PhD to be an experimental scientist, you try to strip all that away. And each one of the science itself is a spectrum of things. We talked about that once, and I wound up putting my foot in my mouth once about something, maybe if it's forgotten, just this as well. But there's a science has a spectrum of the things where it's completely mental things like mathematics and geometry, and you don't really need them You don't need any, or maybe you need a sand table where you can draw pictures of that. But otherwise, I mean, you're dealing so much with concepts and self-consistency that what you get is really like gold standard. I mean, it won't tarnish over the years. I mean, the Euclidean geometry is fixed for all time. You know, then you have other things that are more like studying complex behaviors, either of people, you know, like you have in sociology and humanities, or of complex systems like weather systems and ocean currents and things where everything is influencing everything else. So you need to find out what the central forces and influences are there. I mean, so you can understand them better. So you need supercomputing and a hell of a lot of things. But I mean, but there again, in the study that the weather, you have to be stripping away your personal ideas too. I mean, you can't be a northern hemisphere person. I mean, you should spend half your time facing south and being south of the equator, and seeing that too. The Southern Ocean is a lot bigger than the Arctic Ocean, and I don't see problems with a lot of these things that other people, you know, will talk about. But I love to talk about these problems with other people. You know, that example you took with the dioxin and so forth. There's an area of toxicology, and I can list myself as a toxicologist in certain ways because I have studied mechanisms of toxicology, and I can lecture that to medical students and so forth. And there, I mean, it's a very quantitative thing. As you increase the, let's see, I have to do it like this. Yeah, if you increase the concentration of the drug, then you get a bigger, you get a response. So to trace this, it kind of goes like this, fairly steeply up, and then you give more and more of the drug, and it maxes out at whatever its effect is. And then there's a point where that, at concentration at which you have half maximal activity or half maximal effect. And I mean, that sort of thing's been worked out for dioxin, and mechanisms have been worked out, you know, for that. And am I getting too long-winded here? I just stop and let someone react to that. Maybe someone else has things, but I think there are ways that you can, when you start talking, you look under the hood and you start looking more like what the science is doing and what they're saying. It's a human tendency to overgeneralize whatever conclusion you've got, and maybe to speculate or conjecture beyond what you really know. But of course, that's one of the biggest joys of science, because you do have this emerging picture. You're going through this tunnel, and then things are opening up, and you have more and more information. You know, and life is a lot richer now than it was back when I was, you know, first going to college or graduate school, because, you know, you have a chance to knowing so much more about what's going on. And so I kind of go with the logical positivist that say that if you have a chance to respond.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, Duncan. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you said. So I do appreciate that different scientific disciplines are obviously going to look slightly different in this regard. So, you know, if you think that math is a science, which is a perfectly fine way to categorize what math is, then there's going to be less room for values to enter, you know, the kind of investigation that we engage in when we're trying to construct mathematical proofs. Then there may be room for values entering into scientific investigations in psychology, for example, or you know, the kinds of arguments that we construct for the conclusions that we accept don't have the same kind of character, certainly not the kind of deductive character that you have in a lot of mathematics. So, you know, different sciences are going to look different in this regard, and I think that's absolutely right. I do think that often what's interesting about some of these cases is that, as you were saying, when we find ourselves in an area in which we've done a lot of work so that we have very well-established results, the idea that values may be part and parcel of scientific investigation may seem less plausible. But there are all kinds of stages earlier than that at which, especially if we need to act on our best science, and we don't think we've reached the point at which it's fully established to the best of our ability, there's lots more room there for values having entered. And, you know, that's, for example, part of what I think has been interesting about the way the general public has responded to research into COVID-19. As soon as it became clear that there was a pandemic, people wanted their answers. And of course, you can understand, because lives are at risk and many people have died. But there, we're very far from having something that we could regard as settled science to the best of our ability. And there, I think, you know, values have to be illuminated and scrutinized. So, you know, it's important to think about these things at different stages in the process. And it's also important to think about different kinds of sciences and the sorts of ways in which they reason.
I think,
yes. Hello, everyone. I'm new to this group. This is fascinating. Thank you, Anjan, for entertaining us with scholarly knowledge. A couple of comments I have on the topic of scientific studies. And as we know, the commercial element behind some of these studies is not always known or published sufficiently to the public. And to give you examples, the oil industry had led in many of hundreds of products, and especially in the gasoline, and they denied it for 50 years that it caused any human damage, et cetera, et cetera. We all sort of know this story. And but likewise, the meat industry, the dairy industry, the grain industry, they all throw out these fake diets of low fat and low carb and low this and low that. And what they're really doing, for example, the sugar industry, because everyone was trying to stay away from sugar, they were funding, you know, fat diets and all this other stuff. So where am I going? At one point, I read an interesting article, maybe 5-10 years ago, that said all studies should really be published the way they did it, not just how they wrote a report in a magazine journal, but should be what they did, step A, B, C, to determine the result of D, should be in a public forum, at least for all the industries and all the universities, for any scientific group worldwide to test it. And the psychiatry example is, someone does some research and decides 30% of all females in the 19th century or so are hysterical. They have the hysteric disorder. And here are all the symptoms, you know, waking up by 8 a.m. is one, whatever. And throw it out to the cloud. Now, do you know in your career, your background, has something like that ever been done to really fine tune what we know about, for example, psychological disorders? Instead of just depending on a few small groups that say schizophrenia needs to be split into these 3 parts and it's these 2 genes. Well, put that up for exploration. What do you think?
The academic literature, nothing's published in it, in the academic literature, that hasn't been through this process of sharing.
The saying was something different, maybe like the
discovery of people who are being fraudulent in their science publications, due to who's funding them.
Yeah, to train a really critical eye on the industries. So
Yes, I
even
agree.
people who publish in academic magazines who are backed up by industry with the long arm, they should be, double checked in your estimation. I think, Lisa, there's another level of fact checking that needs to go on with a critical eye to business.
It's easy to buy people off when you are a very large industry, and you can have professors write your books, extolling the virtue of some element. And that's why, sort of an independent cloud-based something out there that doesn't depend on whether or not the editor of Scientific American is going to show your rebuttal to what got published. Anyway, it just
I love it myself.
I'd like to chime in on this, but I think Selva and Christine had things to say, and maybe if there's time, I'll jump in later.
Good.
Unmute yourselves.
Do you want me to go next, or?
Please.
Okay. So all of these topics are so thoroughly discussed and debated in anthropology, of course. So many conflicts of interest, everything from archaeology versus indigenous land rights, museum studies versus indigenous artifacts, and all of that. And then things like in environmental anthropology, traditional environmental knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge versus the conservation biologists who come in, all of those things. But there were two ideas that I thought might be useful to discuss about what you just talked about. One of them is the precautionary principle, which I think started off in conservation biology regarding climate change and environmental conservation, things like that. And that idea was that when you don't have definite knowledge of a subject, you err on the side of caution with, the decisions that you're making. And I think that's also been co-opted by some of the health communities, like eating organic food, for example. Maybe we don't have all the data on it, but some of us choose to do so based on the precautionary principle. So that whole concept, I think, is one area for discussion. And then another one, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with all of the WEIRD research, with WEIRD as an acronym. It's like Western, educated, industrial, whatever the rest of the acronym is. I'm sure you're all familiar with those studies. I think it came out a couple of decades ago, basically critiques of psychology and other social sciences that showed that something like 99% of the studies and the results actually took place with very sort of outlier examples of Western, using mostly undergrad students and, Western universities and stuff comprise the bulk of the knowledge of these fields. So anyway, if anyone wants to comment on those two areas, the precautionary principle and the whole WEIRD concept, I think both of those are relevant to the discussion.
Nice.
I agree.
Selva, did you have something to say? Your hand is up.
Really? Okay, well, I didn't know my hand was up. Actually, I'm a fly on the wall. I'm an artist, not a scientist, but I've been a guinea pig of science, and I love the idea of, values in science. And I've been invited at one point even to form part of an ethics team in a hospital. So I kind of understand where you guys are going in terms of, the ethics of testing and how some of the things, have not been proven. And since I'm a guinea pig from the Women's Health Initiative for 30 years, I've been tested up and down. And I think that they've acted in a very ethical fashion. And I think that sometimes if people are not aware of this testing, I think I came in when you were talking about this one where they were administering electricity and how, the ethics of that. So that's kind of historical. I think we all know about that particular issue. So I think there's a fine line, and I think the ethics sometimes, if the product is so important, and you were talking about COVID, like what's the ethics of taking a drug and putting it on the market when we're not completely sure if, what the repercussions of it are going to be, 10 years down the line. Is that people who had the drug, are they going to develop something else like that, or did with So, but the thing was that there was a need. It had to be done quickly. So I think sometimes ethics have to be kind of moderated because the need is greater. So it's a wonderful field. I mean, it's very interesting. But since I'm an artist and not a scientist, I think I'll listen more than talk.
I do want to say something about weird. And yeah, so not sure if Carol Gilligan's study was, that her mentor, Kohlberg, didn't introduce women at all into the study when he was studying moral responsibility. And that he decided that moral responsibility was following the rules as they were set by men in brackets. So when he introduced women into the study, that the ethics of care and responsibility, started becoming more prominent. So yeah, that's our big example in sociology. But I wanted to throw something other, about the Hawthorne effect, that people being studied want to please the researcher, and also that human beings, if they know they're being studied, they will react, either to help or not. So that is a big deal when you're studying live human beings, especially in sociology and social science. So what do you all think about the idea of you do the study, you tell them a little bit, and then after the study's over, then you debrief them and de-hoax? Is that still acceptable as a methodology to sort of circumvent the Hawthorne effect?
It'd be okay with me.
So yeah, anyway, and also the opposite of weird, I guess, it's when people were, racialized people were being studied for their cranial size and, for their habits that were assumed because of their colonial status. So I don't know if that's part of the opposite end of that. Sergio did his entire master's thesis on how, racialization happened in Argentina, and the intellectual history of some of the big people here oh God, his name is completely flown out of my brain. But, educational ministers in Argentina, like Sarmiento, who's after whom the Day of Education in the world is named after, he used these racialized methods to do his work. So, that critique of colonialism should also be done. I know Lisa put forward the critique of business, and critique of colonialism also needs to be infused into critique of research and what is being studied and whose interest is it in.
So could I perhaps just throw out some categories that might help to talk about some of the things that
yes, please.
Lisa and Selva and Christine and that you, Glima, have just mentioned? So I think some distinctions might be helpful here in just discussing these different cases. So, I want to perhaps separate out 3 different ways in which things might go wrong, to put it over simply, right? I mean, one is in which people who are motivated by certain values, they might be economic values, they might be political values, they might be others, right? Try to subvert what would otherwise be good science. So, this, Lisa, certainly incorporates the kind of case you had in mind, right? The tobacco type cases where we had the funder effect. I mean, essentially, isn't it interesting that research that was funded by tobacco ended up coming to conclusions that suited the tobacco lobby, or, what have you. So there are cases in which science is itself kind of subverted by people because they have certain values, be they economic or political or what have you, that lead them to attempt to undermine what would otherwise be good science. I think that's one kind of case, and it's a very important case of values playing a role in this case, kind of subverting science. We see a form of this, not so much in paying for research results, but in things like climate denialism, where, again, economic interests are driving people to misrepresent genuine science by, for example, publicizing to a much greater proportion outlier results as opposed to mainstream consensus results and so on. So, some of the cases that I think you put your finger on nicely are ones in which, the science itself is being undermined by people with certain kinds of interests and values. Another case, so the second of the three cases that I had in mind is, what we might call pseudoscience, where it really isn't science. There might be, you might think of astrology or homeopathy or whatever your favorite pseudoscience is, where in the promotion of a pseudoscience, scientific knowledge gets undermined, right? That's a different kind of undermining, but it may be driven by certain interesting values. The last case that I have in mind is where we actually are doing science as well as we possibly can. So the science isn't being undermined, right, by people who are intentionally trying to subvert it. And neither is it pseudoscientific, so far as we can tell. We're using our best techniques and we're using, with the utmost sincerity, right, all of our energy to try to come to well-warranted conclusions. And yet, it turns out that certain kinds of assumptions and values are baked into the minds of researchers in the area in such a way as to skew the results in ways they wouldn't be otherwise. So, examples of colonial science or racialized science, or for that matter, androcentric science, right, where there are just male biases that enter into research on hormones or research in, the cognitive studies, cognitive difference research that Janet Karani talks about in the paper that Glima sent around. Those are cases where I think people are engaging in science sincerely. It turns out that there are biases, values that need to be exposed in order for science to get better. And, what do we do there? Well, I think, your suggestion of having more complete divulging of the kinds of things that go into producing research and coming to certain conclusions is helpful. But, and this isn't to disagree with you at all, it's actually just to augment, I hope, what you're saying. What's really required, if that's going to be helpful at all, is greater diversity in the scientific community. Because, if there are no women in a particular area of science, it's much less likely that male-centered biases are going to be exposed in that area of science.
Yeah.
If there are no members of the colonized population doing science, it's much less likely that things that people take for granted that are, false, right, are going to be exposed because those points of views aren't being represented. So among the many things that, philosophers of science often suggest as being sort of requirements if we're going to try to have the best scientific practice we can have, things like, genuine peer review, things like, intellectual egalitarianism, so that people from, different institutions can actually critique each other's work and be taken seriously. Among those things, in this sort of recipe of things that would help to favor better knowledge production, one of them is just diversity, so that some of these, hidden biases can be exposed. So anyway, that was just an attempt to draw together some of the things you were all saying.
Isn't there a little bit of sort of modern bias when scientists say that things are ancient or that astrology doesn't? I mean, I'm not a believer in stuff, but I'm slowly trying to respect more some of the ancient arts that are not really taken into account by modern science, like yoga, or my mom just did a little thing that I sent to Christina on finger yoga. So, just pinching something and sitting there for 10 minutes, it actually has an effect. It has some neural effect that may not have been studied. So could number 2 not be sort of part of the diversity, like examining the old arts or, be more inclusive of things that are dismissed too readily.
Yeah, I certainly think there's a lot to that. So one of the topics that has become quite important to people, certainly in science studies recently, is the idea of indigenous knowledge or local knowledge. And this is extremely important just because often in local or indigenous contexts, the people who really do know the most about, say, for example, a particular environment or a particular, botanical set of facts or a particular whatever set of facts are people who actually have local knowledge. I think I would like to make a distinction between that kind of knowledge, which I think is, you're absolutely right, has value. And if we really want to appreciate its value from another perspective, we need to investigate it, right? And things that are investigated and are found to have no worth. So, to give you an example, when I was an undergraduate, I started out in biophysics. That was my field. And one of my professors was really interested in acupressure, acupuncture, basically the kind of theoretical underpinning of yoga, the idea that there are energy lines in the body and that they can be manipulated so as to produce, good therapeutic effects. And so what he did, I mean, he was a Western trained, medical biophysicist. What he did was investigate, what happens when you stimulate this point, what's happening electrophysiologically, right? So as to try to understand whether from, the perspective of his science, he could actually illuminate certain effects, and, and he was successful in doing so. What that suggests is that, the local knowledge or the indigenous practice of a particular part of the world had merit. It hadn't been described in the terms that are used in another science, but that could be illuminated through investigation. On the other hand, and I don't mean to offend anyone who's a big fan of astrology, I think astrology has been subject to investigation, right, of various forms, and it's just nonsense, right?
Yeah.
It's fun, but it's nonsense. So, does that undermine it as something that's fun? No. Does it undermine it as a basis on which serious people should be matchmaking their children, and deciding what they should be? Of course it does, right? So I would want to make that distinction.
Yeah.
Oh, so I have a question.
I totally agree. Oh, go on.
No, I just had a question about this, maybe to you, because there's this sort of difficulty when discussing these sorts of issues with people who are studying, for example, knowledge practices in other places or other cultures and so forth. And so that you don't want to become too relativistic about knowledge, right? And say everything goes. But how do you talk to people that are, for example, studying, I don't know, the Caribbean Obeah, practices, or where it's voodoo dolls and things like that, and you're like, well, that's not something we should believe in, and etc. But you don't want to offend, and anyway, so that's sort of where I'm coming from. This kind of discomfort of talking about different cultures, different practices, and then imposing a kind of more Eurocentric, Euro-American kind of standard.
Christine, would you say it's sort of an artistic pathway, a narrative pathway that's sort of traditionally set to passing on tales of the family, or like a nursery rhyme, like scaring children about things to be scared about in nature? I mean, can it be understood scientifically as sort of a conduit for those things, for narrative and oral history?
Well, I totally agree with what they were just saying, that we can't just simply give up to moral relativism and say anything goes. Of course not. There's a big distinction between discovering the science behind acupuncture versus female genital mutilation or something else. So it's not anything goes for sure. But within anthropology and within environmental anthropology, which I'm more knowledgeable about, there's an entire field of traditional environmental knowledge, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, with a whole bunch of acronyms. And all of these aspects are discussed, very thoroughly and all of that. But yeah, and then like regarding the acupuncture and yoga example, a couple of years ago, they just discovered a new organ. I think it's called the interstitium that runs through the body. And, you know, that's just an example of like a very recent scientific discovery validates a very old practice. So I think those distinctions are really important. Some things we find the science for to explain, and then other things are just simply harmful. So we can't just evolve into moral relativism and say anything goes. I agree with them.
I think, yeah, I love the points everybody's making. This is good. One interesting thing, especially in that anthropological realm where we are trying to retain the last bits of language from the last speakers around the world. You know, hundreds of languages, they're at the end of their speaking existence. But it's kind of a trigger to finding out about botanical healing properties or whatever in the environment. It was interesting to that culture, those people, for 10,000 years, by going after the language first. If they had 17 words for beetles, why? You know, what did they find out about certain beetles? Or, you know, starting with the vocabulary and say, why did society make up a word for that? They recognized and differentiated that from something else. So I find that interesting.
So
I hope they're doing that.
So it's a carrier of knowledge, really, that we're maybe losing very quickly.
Yeah, you got to grab that language and then interview them on all these, any word that is not obvious. You know, you know the old expression that the Eskimos have so many words for snow. Well, why? What are the properties they noticed that some snow scientist wants to know about? I'm just making it up now. Somebody else speak.
Elva? You're on mute. Unmute.
Okay, I have a question. My son is a medical doctor, and so I know, and I've always been interested in the field of psychology. So then when you talked about hysteria and the whole thing, and I've always protested that. That was one subject where I failed in, because the teacher was teaching that women were hysterical, that we had male envy and blah, blah, blah. And she was using a criteria, and then it's been proven incorrect in terms of hysteria and so forth. And when I asked my son about, you know, healing, and I said, would you say that 80%, no, 50% of the people that you see, that really it's more of an emotional health issue that they have? He said, Mom, it's probably more like 80 or 90%. So that when you're doing these studies and these doctors are giving out all these pills who've been through, you know, ethical review, etc., where a doctor gives you a sugar pill, is that ethical or not? Because the emotional component of a person's healing, and we're talking about indigenous healings and these things that we don't know about, acupressure and acupuncture, it could have an effect on the brain. And that has not been, I mean, I think there have been studies, I haven't read about them, but there's definitely studies showing that it has a healing effect. It hasn't been proven. And there's another area that I've been very interested in also, is the area of the brain and death and dying. And I look into those things, and I think to myself, there have been studies now also, how ethical is that? Because it goes against people's religion. So there's a lot of areas in terms of ethics of studies that I question, because when people come out with absolutes and they have all these things on TV and they tell you that this is proven and go take this, there's a lot of marketing out there. So I'm glad that scientists are actually developing ways of, you know, measuring and finding out if these things are valid and putting the ethical question into it. So it's been very interesting to me, the whole topic.
I wanted to remind you of our colleague Oscar. What is his last name? Valverde. Anyway, he did a talk about the roots and rhizomes under the ground, and how they actually talk to each other, but it's actually through fungus, old fungus. So it's so fascinating. And my brother Gopi is also doing that kind of research, and they're putting a lot more emphasis not on just a lab experiment, which he always does, but in looking at the environment, the microbiome in which those plants function. So it's really neat to see that.
I'm especially fascinated in that area. You know, the botany of the communication, if you will, albeit chemical, of plants. And there's a certain tree in Africa, for example, that once a giraffe starts to chew its leaves, it exudes chemistry, and that chemistry goes, those particles, if you will, go through the air and hit the other trees before the herd of giraffes move on, or whatever critter it is that's eating. And by the time they reach that next group of trees, the trees have exuded a very bitter chemical that makes the animal not want to chew too much. So I love this stuff. And it took microbiology to get there, because without those skills, we wouldn't even know what question to ask, right? You know, it's not about playing classical music to a plant. It's about chemistry, and love that area. Thanks for bringing
Lisa,
that one up.
just for fun, it is actually giraffes, and there are acacia trees.
Oh,
Thank you. Thank you. You get the free car.
Okay, well, I put mine in here too. As I remember it, it's well, I know it's a volatile organic chemical, and I think it might be ethylene.
There we go.
Which diffuses. And
Nice.
these things are beautiful, and they go into our minds very well.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain benevolence to it, you know, and there's interconnectedness and so forth. But it can be understood in terms of lucky accidents that happen, and the ones that are good, they breed better survival for these trees, and the ones that are bad, those have been tested. We don't know about them because they were tested and didn't have any value.
Yeah. Can you imagine 20 years before, a scientist, a botanist, trying to get funded to say, I think these trees are talking to each other and warning each other? You know, we didn't even know how to form the study yet. Science is changing at such rocket pace now.
Crazy. Anjan, I did want to ask you something about the Qurani article. I don't know if any of you had a chance to read it, but it seems that, why is it that in social science, why is social science lagging behind the life sciences in actually putting down rules of fair play, or however you want to put it, of, you know, oversight? Why are we so slow at it?
That's an excellent question, Galima.
Yeah.
Somebody who's an expert in the social sciences, such as yourself, might have an answer to that question.
Very hard. I have two quick answers for Lisa and Selva. Sorry, my screen is really small. So Lisa, you were asking about cultural diversity conservation and biological diversity conservation. And there's actually a lot of overlap between the two. We call it biocultural diversity conservation. So if you look at the maps, the areas where the biological diversity is very high, then the cultural and linguistic diversity is also really high. So you might want to look at some of that info. It's really interesting that they show maps where you can see all the overlaps. And then I wanted to tell Selva, is that your name? There's a whole field of study in medicine called psychophysiologic disorders. And you can show your son, there's a website of the association, I think it's ppdassociation.org or something, which goes into exactly, and it's, you know, by doctors and everything, into some of those overlapping influences for chronic pain and chronic illnesses. you know, like we have this Western distinction between psychological and neurological, but really it's a much more complicated relationship than that. So anyway, just those two quick answers that to you too.
Thank you.
So Glima,
yes.
No, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but I am interested in what you think. But let me try out a hypothesis on you, right? To come back to your question. So in some of these other areas, say in the biomedical sciences or in certain areas of technology, right? This is a very flat-footed, guess answer to your question. I think people perceive the potential harms of what may come of research in certain areas in more universal ways than might be the case when it comes to certain results in the social sciences, because results in the social sciences often play into existing forms of discrimination and social otherness that isn't the case in the former. So that sounds very abstract. I mean, to put it concretely, if you think that someone is developing something that could be used as a biological weapon, right? You think, well, everybody think that's a bad idea because they could all imagine dying from being exposed to a biological weapon. If you think that someone's doing research that shows that men are better at a certain kind of reasoning than women, well, all of a sudden there are going to be a group of men who have chauvinistic tendencies who aren't going to be particularly bothered about that. They're going to be a group of women who are especially bothered by that. And that research, even the potential results, play into existing sets of biases and divisions in society, which makes it disanalogous to some of these other cases where they think, oh, we're all going to suffer. And, if you're deeply androcentrically biased, you might think, yeah, bring on that research. It would be interesting to know. Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know whether that's part of the explanation or not. I think you might know better.
I don't know if I know better, but I'm thinking about it right on my feet right now. But it's like we are the tool. We don't have an external tool in social science. So the tool is studying, the subject is the subject. So
Yeah.
very confounding. Like you have your values and you're using your lenses with your values as the tool to observe. So obviously it's going to be jaded or colored.
Life in business or commerce or anything else, there's that difference. And I mean, we just take that as a given. These are differences, I mean, for climbing up telephone poles, in the middle of the night in the snow and sleet, it's probably better to have a male.
Duncan, the problem with that kind of research is not that there may not be differences, is that the research attributes those differences to cognitive differences between men and women. And that research has been shown again and again and again to be garbage, because there are so many confounding factors and variables that may determine why it is that women in a certain context may tend to be more nurturing, may tend to be more intuitive, that have nothing to do with cognitive differences. They may have to do with how they've been educated, how they've been acculturated, how they've been. So the cognitive differences research, I think, is a great example of research which has just been really badly done.
Well, I think maybe they're making false generalizations with it.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Establish terrible research.
Yeah.
Yes, say it again.
Yeah, and the other thing that I know about cognitive difference studies is that I have talked to people who study these areas, and often they talk about how the brain itself is shaped by culture. So that even if you can establish some kind of objective differences, we kind of tend to think that the brain is kind of wired in a particular way and that it's static. Whereas, all the things that Anjan was just talking about, this idea that education culture, it's going to influence the brain structure, and your environment is going to influence the brain. And so that, it's kind of like you can't just think of the brain as giving us some kind of objective measure of genuine difference. What we're looking at is this thing that is soaking up the environment, and it's generating these differences, but they could be otherwise in a different environment.
I agree with that.
I was going to ask Alexandra about, to end, actually we only have 5 minutes, but if you have any thoughts about research that was done on animals, because I know that you may specialize in that.
Oh gosh,
No,
there's a really interesting documentary, Test Subjects, that I showed my class last semester. That was it's free to be seen online. It's, you know, it's readily available, and it basically tracks the kind of emotional impact that some of the research on animals has on the researchers. But also the upshot of it was that a lot of the research of animals really is kind of doesn't give us any genuine knowledge at all. It's just in case you hear some data, but they don't know what to do with it. A lot of the experiments just are kind of, you know, as the researchers themselves put it, they're kind of pointless. They don't know really why they're doing these experiments, because they don't translate very well to the human body necessarily. So we always talk about these continuities, evolutionary continuities, but somehow, you know, the systems just don't always translate, and yet these experiments are repeated over and over again. And so that's the subject of that documentary. I thought that was really interesting. I can't say any more about that because I don't actually study that area specifically, the ethics of experimentation, but that was really insightful, I think. And we had a really good discussion about you know, whether there are better methods, like synthetic methods, other test tube methods, right? Instead of using animal bodies, because there are better, you know, you can use human tissues and things like that, which would be better than it's much better than using an animal body, right? Like rats and stuff like that. So
Anjan, in the last 2 minutes, do you want to put the cherry on top of our discussion cake today?
I don't know that I can. There have been so many cherries. I just thought it was a wonderful discussion. I thought there were so many great points that everyone raised, and you know, these topics are of, you know, long-standing interest to me, but they become especially, I mean, even more professional interest to me in virtue of this new position that I have at the University of Miami.